I am now pleased to welcome to the stage Congressman Erik Paulsen. Congressman Paulsen is a member of the House Ways and Means Committee Subcommittee on Trade. Of NAFTA, Congressman Paulsen has said that trade has an important role in the future growth of the economy. Bob?
Thanks, Katie. First off, can you describe what NAFTA and these negotiations mean for your districts back home? What are you hearing about these negotiations, how important it is?
Sure. And first, thanks for hosting this and having this conversation at a very timely opportunity, actually, with everything going on. So you think of a state like Minnesota, and obviously the country, I think, in the United States has benefited greatly with 3.8 million jobs. You've got, with NAFTA, $2 billion of flow going back and forth. And in Minnesota, look, we're a border state, but we also, with our top two trading partners, are now Mexico and Canada. And it's not because we are a border state itself, but I think it's primarily because of NAFTA being oriented 2 decades ago that's put us in a position now for enhanced trade opportunity, more job growth development. We have a lot of exports out of Minnesota, not just agriculture, but high-value manufacturing that we feel are very important.
Now, there's been, President Obama said he's going to renegotiate NAFTA. President Trump campaigned on it and is doing it. Do you think it's a good idea to update NAFTA, to revise it?
I really do. It's important to modernize it. Look, when it was done a couple of decades ago, we didn't have digital trade.
Right.
We're going to have a conversation with Susan Delbany, who's going to be out in a little, my colleague, and we co-chair the Digital Trade Caucus, and we're educating our colleagues about the importance of digital trade. When you have e-commerce going on that didn't exist 2 decades ago, we should be modernizing. The good news is, all indications are that those portions of the negotiations have been going very well in terms of making sure that the data is going to be able to flow back and forth and be enhanced. So we should be modernizing it. And then I think issues like de minimis issues where you want, our goods to go into other countries at a higher threshold, where the United States has an $800 level, Canada's down to 16, I believe. It's a little more fair to modernize that and have that be a little bit more equal. It's going to facilitate the movement of goods and services a lot more quicker.
What are you looking for? What's important for you in the deal?
Well, the most important thing, obviously, is continuing the strong economic relationship. But aside from that, the United States, we should be fighting for dairy. We should be fighting for intellectual property protections, as we learned over the last couple of decades, that are very important to the United States, and the Canadians don't have as strong of intellectual property protection. And making sure the geographic indicators that have been used by some countries, and Canada's used some of those, are also a part of these negotiations. So those are the tough nitty-gritty parts. But I also think my perspective is we shouldn't have sunset clauses put in. I know the administration's argued for that. But I think for the long term, for certainty, for predictability, for the business community and for the economy to function for the long term, sunset clauses are not a good idea, for instance.
So do you think that it's better, like now, decades later, now it's been decided, let's revise it, so not necessarily a finite amount of time, 5 years or 10 years, just whenever you think, when policymakers think this should be updated?
Well, and I think that's the case now. We've gone a couple of decades. It's time to modernize it. I expect that'll be the case again. I also believe in, look, a lot of my colleagues signed a letter, sent it to the administration, also emphasizing the importance of investor state protections. So if we're going to have investors from the United States invest in other countries, we want to make sure the rules of the road are followed under our system where they know that those investments are sound. So if we have American workers and businesses that need to be protected as they're chasing customers in other countries, we want to make sure those are sound provisions as well. And
there have been a number of business associations who are very concerned about that. Is that the #1 issue from businesses that you're hearing about?
Probably in the top 2 or 3, I would say, for sure. The North American and American content issues on rules of origin, the sunset provision, and then the investor provisions are probably the top 3. And look, we do have new rules now in Congress in terms of how Trade Promotion Authority is moving us forward in this process. That's good news. So the timeline that is out there, best scenario, we conclude this in the next few days and have a renegotiated, modernized NAFTA signed into law by this Congress. But the next best scenario is we have a successful, negotiated, modernized NAFTA that is finished and completed soon, but that gets signed into law by the next Congress. Those are the 2 best scenarios that we should be emphasizing and pushing for.
Do you think that, Paul Ryan set an informal deadline of tomorrow. Do you think that, okay, there's not going to be a deal by tomorrow, but what if there was a deal in the next month? Do you think that Speaker Ryan should say, okay, well, let's get it done this before, before the elections happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a statutory deadline, but it is a fairly compact schedule because of these new rules for our negotiating process. We have a 30-day window now for the text to be put out to Congress. We've got a 90-day rule where we consult back and forth with the administration, with Congress. That's good news for the broader Congress, not just members of Ways and Means Committee, to be exposed to all the different issues. And then we have a 60-day period that's set in the Trade Promotion Authority rules to be open to the public for comment as well. So you have a timeline that crunches us into December. We still have time to finish by the end of December if we don't complete this by May 17th, but you know, it's compressing.
What about the politics of trade? Obviously, NAFTA has been controversial, and then there were other trade deals, CAFTA, and one aide said CAFTA was so difficult to get through that they would never have a trade deal again that would rhyme with NAFTA. And we saw with the TPP and President Trump and Bernie Sanders on the campaign trail. I mean, just talk about the politics of trade, and you know, it would be as difficult as a deal would be to get, whether it's this Congress that approves it or the next one. It's still going to be tough for Congress to approve any deal, right?
It will be. Trade deals, if you've looked at every vote we've ever had on any of them, have always been fairly tight, fairly close. And that's the component of, I think, the political nature of those deals. And that's negotiation that goes on that every member would have to sell individually to their district. But look, I look at a state like Minnesota where 600,000 jobs are tied to international trade, and I've got a fairly well-balanced district itself, other than Minnesota, that, you know, they're highly educated, you know, Cargill and other companies that do a lot with international movement of goods and services, but also a lot of small businesses now that do high-value manufacturing, medical device companies, for instance, that weren't around 20 years ago exporting to the level they are right now, improving healthcare outcomes around the world. So I think it's getting easier for folks to sell American goods and services, or the idea of doing that and exporting that around the world, when that's where 96% of the world's consumers live. And Canada is one of our best friends and allies on a relationship standpoint, where we should enhance and strengthen it.
How has the Trump administration been as far as briefing Congress on where the talks are going?
Well, early on, the administration was a little bit more forthcoming with the president and Ambassador Lighthizer. They would come to the Hill. They'd have meetings privately with the Ways and Means Committee members in particular. Were very open. And, you know, that kind of got, I think, pushed aside a little bit, partly because I think they've been consumed with some of their other trade policies, you know, going to China, et cetera, back and forth. So they're having a meeting, though, I believe, today with the new Democratic caucus, New Democrats. So those engagements are still going. And so there's a lot of behind-the-scenes conversation and activity happening, which is a good thing as we move forward to finality.
You mentioned the Digital Trade Caucus. What was the impetus of starting that with Congress Del Bene? I mean, how did it get going?
Well, it got going because when TPP was being discussed, and for those of us that do believe that it's important to have those types of regional agreements, we didn't want to lose the progress that had been made with digital trade to say, look, you can't just have your data secured only in one country. You got to have data flow across borders. E-commerce relationships are very important to sell. And a lot of small businesses rely on that now in the United States, as an example. So I think that opened the door to saying, hey, there are a lot of members of Congress that aren't as familiar with digital trade, not realizing it applies to mining companies, agriculture, all kinds of hosts. You don't have to be an IT company to embrace or be a part of digital trade. And so we got 45 members, I believe, who are in the caucus. It's growing, and we're sharing and educating with our colleagues the importance of it. So that's a good sign.
As far as what stakeholders can do, we've seen more people involved in politics than ever before, whether it's net neutrality or the Affordable Care Act or trade. What can stakeholders do to influence this process?
Yeah, I think the best direction for stakeholders to actually share to make progress on this would be this. Share anecdotes, share stories, invite elected officials to tour your business or your operation, and then share the percentage of the business that is now being exported. And I've certainly done that in my community and in my district. And it was interesting in a state like Minnesota, where we weathered the economic storm a lot better than a lot of other countries during the recession. And a big part of that was due to our exports, actually. I mean, you take a company like General Mills, which is a big company, but 95% of everything General Mills sells in Canada is made in the U.S. So selling American goods and services. And I think if our elected officials hear those stories, not just numbers, but they actually hear the stories from their employers and their workers, they're more apt to be comfortable and then sell it themselves.
How do you think that President Trump has affected the Republican policy on trade. He's really changed the party in a lot of ways, and a lot of people specifically mention trade.
Well, you know, there have been some challenges or changes there, I should say. And look, you look to some of the states like Ohio or Kentucky or West Virginia, or states that are more Rust Belt states that have been oriented around steel, right, and production or coal at that level. And I think there's been some concern. So I think he's tapped into an area that there's been a little less economic success, for instance. But I think it's short-sighted to lose perspective, understanding full well that when we talk about steel tariffs or aluminum tariffs, that could backfire in a hurry when those are broad-based, and that we don't want to lose other manufacturing jobs, because we have seen now a growth, as an example, in steel applications for extrusion that small businesses use, and now we're seeing some pullback in the energy sector, as an example, where we produce a lot of pipelines with American steel and other steel as a component. And that is hurting, ironically, the same type of folks that the president is intending to help. And so I think as we become more, as the supply chain has become more integrated, there's just more of a realization or an education level that has to happen with folks.
Why don't we open it up for questions? If you have a question, please identify yourself, and we'll have a mic come to you. Just wait for the mic, please.
Stacy Bridges with Veterans Vision. I was wondering how all the anti-NAFTA talk has hurt our farmers before the actual trade has started. I know Mexico has decided to go with Brazil in getting their corn, and our farmers have lost billions. So is this a trend that's going to continue before the talks even start?
Well, it's a good question. I think the concerns we've heard from the agriculture community, and I've certainly heard this in Minnesota, and the realization is that, you know, in today's world, countries or organizations are not going to wait. They're going to have to look for tapping into other resources or supply chains that maybe weren't around a decade ago. And those opportunities in a global market where things are happening at the click of a mouse, you can move capital very quickly. I can understand and appreciate why there's going to be a hedging of other countries or organizations to plan ahead. And so, you know, there is risk, obviously. And so, sure, it's okay to have some of the bluster with some of the trade negotiation strategies and talks, but in the end, it's so important for us to conclude this deal and have it to finality, not only to help agriculture as an example, but other sectors as well.
Do you think, that, let's say a deal is not done in the short term, okay, so then it's kicked to the next Congress, and let's say the House or the Senate flips. More Republicans support trade deals than Democrats. Do you think that a Democratic chamber of Congress would back a deal that was struck by the Trump administration?
You know, it depends on what the details are of the negotiation, obviously. I expect, though, that there will be bipartisan support, as there has been on several of the other trade deals that have passed in more recent years. And I don't think that that would change. I think one of the challenges we have on the Republican side is, as we saw TPP come to conclusion, we had a lot of Republicans that were opposed to TPP. And part of that was maybe with President Obama leading that effort. And so now you have the flip side with President Trump. But I think in the end, what is so important is that we just have finality or conclusion for economic security and competence and predictability, to not upset what we enjoy with a strong, vibrant economy and relationship with two of our neighboring countries in North America. And we can be a powerhouse with IP and intellectual property and investor protections and set the rules of the road for other countries around the world.
After November, people are going to, the day after, well, I mean, it's already happening. We're already talking about the 2020 election. But that is an impetus for, I would imagine, a quick deal as quickly as possible, because then when you get into presidential politics, trade always gets wrapped up in that.
Right. And I think that's what happened with TPP. We came up under the pressure of a presidential election. And so all indications are now, and again, everything has been going, from the briefings we've had, really well behind the scenes on certain chapters within NAFTA. Just a couple of points that have to be fine-tuned, and those are the hot spots at the end. So the farther we stay away from 2020, the better, obviously. But I think, you know, we're looking at significant progress, and we're optimistic that whether it's, you know, May 17th, which is ambitious, or in the near future, we're kind of getting in the crunch time where things should come together, hopefully.
When you talk to Republicans in their districts, I imagine those those disputes over trade are pretty passionate? Because it really varies from district to district. I mean, how do you make the case that no, this is actually good for the economy? Because a lot of lawmakers say it's not.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the best things that I've been able to do is visit small employers, medium employers, and the large employers, and they've shared directly their personal stories about the number of jobs they've added because of selling American exports. And I talked about healthcare, for instance, and medical device companies. I mean, we're writing for the first time into our trade agreements medical device provisions, for instance. And this is about improving healthcare outcomes around the world, and at the same time keeping jobs here, keeping innovation here, and keeping those headquarters here. And I think with some of the tax changes that we've had, we're seeing reinvestment back into the United States, and a lot of companies reversing course from overseas coming back here. So that adds to the strength for having strong export markets and opportunity for trade deals down the road.
Do you see that's a big contention now, the tax law? Do you see, in your district, when you travel around the country, are you seeing the effects?
We're seeing the effects on the broader economy on a positive direction, whether it's GDP growth going up or wages going up for employers and employees. But I think most importantly, the most profound impacts of the tax overhaul have not been seen yet because they were the international components that now allow us for the first time to get the earnings back home, not lose manufacturing or innovation or headquarters or jobs overseas, but keep them here. And we're starting to see the impact earlier than we thought, but the long-term lasting impact is going to be felt in the years ahead in a positive way.
Should Republicans talk in this election year more about the tax law?
Absolutely. It's a positive story. I chair the Joint Economic Committee, and our economists that we have working on my team have said every day there are new statistics coming out. For instance, last month, even with the concerns about the deficit, it was the #1 month in the history of the country for a surplus or revenue coming into the government, for instance. And so obviously you got to focus on the other side of the ledger, but for economic growth, for a growing competitive economy, that's a good thing.
Well, please thank Congressman Paulsen for joining us this morning, and I'll hand it back over to Katie. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom. See you later.